Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm George Binns, and I'm here with my co-host, Gail Burke, and we are doing the third in our series of shows talking with the city councilors on the state of the city. And our guest this evening is City Councilor at Large, Julie Flowers. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, George and Gail. It's a pleasure to get to talk with you again, even though it's a little different than when we sit together in your studio, but it's nice to see you.
Yeah. Nice to see you as well.
So I guess the question is, where do you think the city is going, or where do you think it should go?
You know, it's interesting because of course, if we had met before March, we probably would be having a whole different conversation, right? Because so much of what the city and municipal government life has been focused on since March is probably similar to what individuals' lives have been focused on and trying to figure out, which is how do we live and keep one another safe and healthy and well, and try to, and on the city side, right, try to provide services that people need and have kids in school and connect people with city hall services and everything that they need in the midst of a global pandemic. So I think for me, it certainly has been a learning experience. I think it has been for all of us to figure out what it is to try to be part of local municipal government in sort of very unprecedented times for people. But I think we're fortunate too that in Beverly, we have been able to, I think, do a good job of trying to keep folks healthy, safe, and well. Of course, we, like every community, have also lost folks from COVID, and particularly at the beginning of the pandemic in Beverly, there were several families that right away were struggling, had loved ones very sick with COVID, and we want to continue to think of those families and think of people who are struggling with it now. But also, I feel incredibly grateful for the ways that the whole community has really worked to adapt and to keep one another well. We are fortunate to be on Governor Baker's map. We're fortunate still to be in one of the green communities, and that gives us some flexibility to be able to do things like have children in school in hybrid models and have our student athletes going back to playing high school sports. Certain high school sports are resuming now, and also some youth sports are able to resume, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to keep our COVID rates low, and that will allow us to continue to have those kind of opportunities and moments and keep one another well.
COVID thing is going to be over. It's going to be like all the rest of these flu viruses that periodically show up. And once the city gets back on track, where do you think we ought to go? I think that the issues that were on a lot of people's mind before the March shutdowns was where are we going to go with all this building that started out on Rantoul Street? Is it going to spread to Cabot Street? We see a lot of pressure, even coming from the mayor of Boston, to emphasize TOD, transit-oriented development. And the city is was in the middle, and I guess it's in suspension right now of doing the Plan Beverly, which is supposed to be addressing some of that. Where do you think that ought to go?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think we will continue to see some housing development, I would say, because one of the things that we have as a community, I think, been pretty focused on, and I know, George, I've heard you talk about this as well, but just the need for there to be enough affordable and accessible housing for folks. And actually what we really need is housing at sort of every single level. We know that our part of the country is a desirable place to live, but also that people are not always able to find adequate housing. And so I think we will continue to see some of that in an effort to be able to create sustainable and livable city space for folks. I think the Plan Beverly plans that you alluded to that are near completion, we're kind of almost to the end. What's interesting about that is that you're right. The original sort of planning did tend to be situated primarily, it is transit oriented, but primarily in the Ward 2 downtown sort of transit space, some in Ward 3. The Plan Beverly plans take a look at how that could potentially, we could have housing or accessible housing that sort of is spread across wards, and how that might make use of some of the other transportation that we have in the city, particularly train stations. You know, Beverly is unique in that it has more train stations than many other communities in our area, but also how we can think about perhaps other types of increased transportation, whether it be more accessible bus lines or continuing to focus on how to make Beverly a more pedestrian and bike friendly city so that we can ensure that people are better able to get around. I do think that one of the things that definitely was part of the Plan Beverly conversation, we've talked about it here, is the balance between just development for the sake of development and really finding a smart and planful way to increase housing in a city and to have businesses that can really thrive, small local businesses that can really thrive and develop. And of course, our small businesses, COVID has been particularly hard for them. So I think we want to be thoughtful as a community about how we try to continue to support our small businesses.
That's one of the questions that I wanted to ask you about the businesses, particularly the restaurants. Now, I know that some of the restaurants have been able to convert their parking lots into outdoor space. But what happens when the cold weather comes? I know the mayor made some comments about, oh, how wonderful it would be to be eating outdoors in the cold weather. Well, that doesn't work for everybody. People want to be inside and warm when they're having a dinner and paying money for it. So what's on the agenda as far as allowing these businesses to reopen to a normal way of doing businesses, because many of them have lost a lot of money during the virus and they need to reopen. So what does the City Council have to say about it?
Thank you. I think you are absolutely right that small business in general, well, business in general, but we know our local small businesses across the board have really been hit hard in this time, but we definitely know that restaurants and our local restaurants, that's an industry where it's particularly hard because so much of that industry is about people being able to gather, right, and gather together. So I think part of the indoor dining piece really has to do with us trying to follow to the best of our ability direction from the Commonwealth and from where Governor Baker has the reopening plan in terms of capacity that indoor seating can be at. I think one of the things that I'd like to see us be able to at least help emphasize and maybe think creatively about how we could even maybe do some city kind of PSA campaigns maybe, but a lot of our restaurants have also been extremely creative but extremely hardworking about how to increase their takeout or increase their curbside pickup or increase their delivery. And so really helping to get the word out that there are hardworking restaurant owners and restaurant staff that we can support even for folks who might not be comfortable going out and dining in person. And that part of that too is helping think together as a community about, often I think if I dine in person, I know I'm going to tip my server and I'm tipping for service. I've tried to be a lot more thoughtful about even if I'm running in and picking up, really tipping generously because I know that people aren't able to go out and eat. So if we can help our community be thinking about ways that they can be supporting our restaurants, even if they may not yet feel comfortable going out and dining in person, I think that's important. I see restaurant posts from restaurant owners almost every day on different social media platforms of some of our wonderful downtown restaurants. And I really see how hard they are working and how creative they're being. So I think our role is to try to amplify those messages and really encourage folks to be there and to get out and support them to the fullest extent that they can so that these restaurants can be there on the other side. As George said, when COVID is finally over, when we've moved somewhere new, We
But
definitely
you
want.
have to mention the role of the city council in this. The mayor has been making unilateral pronouncements on how to walk on the street and wear a mask and all this stuff, which raises the other question of the other activity that's going on in the city is the Charter Commission. It's been a few years since it's been reviewed, and it's time to look at it again. And my question is, what is your feeling about having the kind of system we have now, strong mayor, weak city council, and perhaps changing that to mayor and a stronger city council, or even going to a system like some of the cities around where you have a city manager and a relatively strong council? Where do you come down on that kind of discussion?
Sure. And I think it's, I guess, important just to note for folks at home to be able to know that some of the decisions that have come out are the mayor is maybe voicing them, but also our Board of Health, our Department of Health has been really instrumental in many of those COVID related decisions. And part of that authority, rests with them in any case, but during a public health emergency, once it's declared, they do have a lot of authority to be able to make some of these decisions for the good of the public health. So I just wanted folks at home to know that we have an extremely hardworking Department of Health that, as you can imagine, they've been working around the clock since March. And so I wanted to acknowledge that they've been putting in that work and time for all of us. I think your question about the Charter Commission is well taken. It is a charter review year, as you well know, and President Guanci does have folks appointed to a Charter Review Commission, and that they were all appointed at the start of this year, back in January, when things were getting going, and I think that's always the question: is what makes sense for Beverly right now in terms of structure. And so I will certainly be interested to see what recommendations the commission comes out with. But I would be interested in our community having a conversation about what you raised, which is right now, for our city right now, what makes the most sense. And I think my feeling is what you were saying, that I think for the city council to be able to have some additional authority beyond what the charter currently grants it, to make for more of a partnership between the mayor and city council's offices. This is not about a specific mayor. I think when we think about the different branches or parts of our government, I think, for my part, it'd be interesting to think about a city where there was a more equal balance between those two branches.
I wanted to talk a little bit about racism, because I know that Beverly has come to the conclusion that racism is a public health issue. How much racism have you seen or do you know about in the city of Beverly? Because having lived there for 13 years, I have to admit that I never saw a trace of it. So I was quite surprised when I saw that in the newspaper. I heard about it from the superintendent, and then we saw the BLM signs and the banners, and the fact that people were allowed to put BLM, Black Lives Matter, chalked in the sidewalk. And why was that allowed? To me, that was sort of not balancing things well. What is your take on that?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll start with your sort of first question and then go from there. So, I think a lot of people, people who look like you or like me, with white skin. Yep. So I've heard people say, I've lived in Beverly, I haven't seen a lot of racism. And so one of the things that I've really been trying to think about, and I think our city is trying to consider, is that often I think that's the way sort of the systemic racism that's woven into sort of all around us. It's like it's like how we don't see the air. We kind of don't always even see the way that racism is woven into the systems around us. That's only if you
believe in systemic racism, which many people do not. And that's part of the problem. When you say systemic racism, you're inferencing that it's there. There is systemic racism. I for one, don't happen to believe it. I haven't seen it. And I know that in Beverly, there's not a lot of diversity. But that's because of where we live, where we're situated, north of Boston. Many of the suburbs, some of the communities are expensive, not only for people of different races, but for many white people as well. So, maybe you could clarify that.
Sure. I will do my best. One thing I was just going to say is that I really have tried to, and I think you're right, Beverly is not as diverse as some other communities, but it is changing, and it has changed even from when I was growing up. And I think that's exciting to think about the way that our community is becoming ever more diverse and brings more and more people together. But I do think one thing I've been trying to do is I've been trying to listen and learn from people of color in our community and learn from them what their experience is like and what they experience every day in Beverly. Because what I experience as a white woman can feel very different from the way that they experience their day-to-day life and what Beverly is like as a community. So I try to be mindful of letting my friends and our community members of color be the experts of their lived experience. And then I have been trying to really learn from them and listen quite a bit and learn what I don't know. I think, your question about systemic racism, one of the things, and I will not pretend to be an expert or, professor in any regard, but one of the things that I have been thinking about and doing some reading about is just the fact that when you look way back in the history of our country, the fact that Native peoples and Black people were enslaved and were bought and sold, it makes me think about the fact that a system like that can't really exist. You can't begin a system like that where not one of us could put a chain around the neck of another human being and lead them away as if they were property. If there wasn't a notion in the system that they were somehow less than others.
That's hundreds of years ago. And
I guess
we have fought a war to alleviate the problem, and it started to go away. It's a big transition, and understand that there are many Black people in this country that also owned slaves. It was not just white people. So I think when you talk about systemic racism and you go back a couple of 100 years, you're not living in the present, because things have changed. Black people have taken the opportunity that is available to everyone here, not just Black people, but minorities. And we have had Blacks and other minorities. They're into government, both local and federal. We had a Black president. We have news media. Every avenue that's available for an American has shown that many, many minorities have taken advantage of it. And now that we're into an election, this whole thing about systemic racism is rearing its ugly head. And it's pushed in the media. There are a number of Black leaders who say it's not true, including Thomas Sowell, the economist, Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, Ben Carson. These are leaders that are saying this is ridiculous. And some of them came from very poor backgrounds, but they managed to be achievers.
Sure.
Well, I think this is one of the issues that needs to be sorted out, that I think everybody recognizes that the minority group that's living in the low rent district is going to get an awful lot of police attention, and it has led to a number of incidents, really. But these are at a national level. And as Gail started to mention, the minority collection in Beverly is something less than 5% of the population. So the emphasis on doing programs aimed at a minority group that's hardly here is hard to understand, especially when they had this meeting of one of these committees, and the chief of police specifically said, if you have some incidents, let me know and I'll work on them. And I don't know that we're really struggling with the same kinds of problems that Chicago or Portland is working on.
Yeah, we're not a big city.
So the emphasis there gets to be confusing, especially when the city council passes an understanding that racism is a health problem. And I think this has been pretty well documented. It's not an effect. But at the same time, what I want to get into is, what are we going to do about it here in Beverly? One of the issues that comes up with the impact on minority health is the lack of housing. So we get around the circle, we're back to the issue of what kind of housing are we building and what kind of a city are we trying to establish or maintain. And this was Councilor Flaherty's comment when we had the discussion with him. What is the character of Beverly?
Sure. Before I jump into that, though, I do just want to say I think it's important, at least for us to think about as a community, that when I talk about what happened hundreds of years ago, I talk about that because the way that something begins, the way that something is born, the way that something is rooted, it has far-reaching effects. And so I would say that our country, yes, there was a civil war, but we've never had a national kind of real reckoning about what slavery meant in our country and what was done and what atrocities were committed. So
well, that's what the civil rights movement was all about.
Sure, and I think,
making it better, which it did, and which it has. So when we go back several hundred years, particularly with the school children, and you dwell on that, you're not emphasizing the positive things that have happened since then, and all the things that our country has been through, trying always to improve. We're a flawed country like any other country, but the improvements we've made far outweigh anything that happened in the past.
I guess I would just say that I think for us to say that I think the civil rights movement was very important. I try to take caution that as a white woman that I not say that it fixed everything, because I hear my friends and my neighbors of color saying that's not their experience. And so I guess, George, to your point about, why are we doing this in Beverly if we don't have as diverse a population? I guess I would say that I think one of the reasons it's important is because, well, each person is important. So for every person in Beverly, every person of color, every person to feel safe, seen, valued, and heard matters and is important and has worth. But I also think about the fact that in a lot of ways, talking about racism and about justice issues is not really a problem. It's not a problem for people of color. It's a white person problem, and it's our problem to grapple with and to talk about. We had doctors. I don't think
it's a white person's problem. I know plenty of white people that are perfectly willing to talk about it, so I don't think it's a problem. I think the biggest problem is when you delineate black, white, brown, pink, purple. People are people. And the Black Lives Matter group, especially when they're putting banners, writing on sidewalks, to me, and they get enraged when you say it, all lives matter. Not just black lives, not just white lives, all lives matter. So wouldn't it be more appropriate to say that all lives matter? Take down the Black Lives Matter, put all lives matter, and that way everybody is encompassed. To me, that's the way to do it.
I think it's true. Of course, each person and each life is important and matters. I think what the Black Lives Matter sentiment and statement is about is really, to me, just saying that until we as people, until we as a country can say and show that, we don't really live into the notion that all lives matter the same. But I don't think that saying Black Lives Matter discounts that anybody else does. I think of it as, if I am raising money for breast cancer awareness, it doesn't mean that I'm saying that all other diseases are not important and worth raising money for.
But
I think
that's what is inferred with those banners.
I guess I just really I think we're so used to we have many ways that we recognize that at a certain moment, a person or a organization or a cause needs our special attention, particular attention or care, without thinking that it just, means that we don't care about anything else. So I believe in us and our ability to bring that same level of, understanding and focus to this. We had Dr. Steinberg from Montserrat College of Art speak to our city council at the last city council meeting. And something he said, I think, really resonated, and maybe I think of it as we're talking. And as we're talking about, why it matters for Beverly to have these conversations, he was talking about anti-racism work that they're doing at Montserrat. And he said that they had begun with their board of trustees, who sort of at first wanted to know, was there an overt incident that happened at Montserrat? And he said, no, there was not an overt incident, but yes, there is also racism at Montserrat. And here's what he said to us. He said, because there's a problem in the world, there's a problem at Montserrat. And because racism is everywhere, no place is untouched. And that's why we need to be talking about this. So, I kind of take Dr. Steinberg's words and for me, I've applied them to our community as well, that there really isn't a community that can say it's untouched by this. I think I've been proud to see Beverly begin to dig into these conversations. I think there is, more work to be done and more good conversation.
The point you're making,
ahead.
I think, is one that needs to be discussed more. And unfortunately, we've used up our half hour. And Julie, I'd like to invite you to come back again and continue this discussion, because I think this is one of the major areas of activity in the city of Beverly. And I think it is not going too smoothly. So there is some conflict, and I think it needs to be talked about from both sides. So would you consider joining us again sometime in the near future?
Of course. Yes. Okay. I'm always happy to be able to come and be in conversation with you. So, good. Of course.
It's great.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us, and hope that you come back and see what the next show is about. Good night, all.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you both very much.
You're welcome.